You're about to hear something that will rattle everything you've ever believed about love, not in a romantic way, not in a comforting way, but in a way that grabs you by the collar and rips off the mask. Because what if I told you that love, the sacred idea sold in poetry and films, is nothing but a calculated con, nature's oldest manipulation tactic? A stunning illusion engineered to make you crawl when you think you're soaring, and it gets worse. One of history's most brutally honest minds believed that every bond of passion is born already fractured, already counting down its own quiet demise. He didn't just believe love would fail, he believed it was designed to. Let me take you back in time, not to a palace or a battlefield, but to a candlelit tavern somewhere in 1800s Germany. A haze of pipe smoke floats under creaking rafters. The laughter in the air is shallow, wine heavy and distracted. But in the corner, seated alone with ink-stained fingers and furrowed brow, is a man who would rip the curtain off all our illusions. His name? Arthur Schopenhauer. A philosopher, yes, but not the kind who paints the world with idealism. No, this man was more surgeon than dreamer. He cut open the human condition with cold steel and didn't flinch. He looked at love and saw a trap. Not a mistake, but a finely tuned instrument of survival dressed up in sweetness. To most, love is exalted, the apex of connection, the answer to life's aching question. To Arthur, it was biology's cruel joke, not because he was bitter, but because he saw something terrifyingly honest beneath the surface. Nature doesn't care about you. It doesn't care if you're fulfilled. It wants one thing only, continuation, and it will feed you lies to get it. Desire, that's the bait. Passion, a temporary chemical haze. Devotion, an illusion so convincing it turns kings into beggars. Nature floods your brain with euphoria, steers your decisions, drags you into obsession, all for a simple purpose: reproduction. And when its purpose is complete, it lets you rot in the ruins of what once felt eternal. The spell lifts, the fog clears, and you're left with a stranger in your bed and a version of yourself you barely recognize. History has no shortage of examples. Take Napoleon, the titan of Europe, a military genius who outmaneuvered empires. But beneath the crown and steel beat a heart that was no match for nature's trap. Josephine. She haunted him, consumed him, reduced the most powerful man on the continent to scribbling lovesick letters from blood-soaked camps. "You are the soul of my soul," he wrote. He didn't see that while he was burning cities for her, she was slipping away without remorse. Schopenhauer would have merely sighed at that, because to him, Napoleon wasn't exceptional in this way. He was typical. Another brilliant mind, shackled by the force that binds us all. Genius offers no immunity to biology. And this force, it doesn't just trick, it deranges. To fall in love, said Arthur, is not merely to surrender. It's to go mad, a fever, a beautiful delirium that consumes the senses. You forget yourself, you speak in absolutes, you act against reason, and then, when the chemicals fade, the fallout begins. You begin asking, was that love? Or was it just a kind of temporary insanity? Were you drawn to them? Or were you simply being pulled by instincts disguised as choice? Let's drag this further into the abyss. In the old world, centuries back, people didn't just believe in love. They believed in love sickness as a medical condition, a fatal one. Men and women withered under the weight of longing. They stopped eating. Their organs shut down. It was seen as a disease that could only be cured by the one they loved, or by removing that person from the world entirely. Treatments included leeching, cold baths, and yes, sometimes even forced consummation. Behind closed doors, entire families crumbled under the spell. Love wasn't seen as sweet, it was seen as dangerous, and rightly so, because it made people do monstrous things. Schopenhauer saw this and didn't blink. In his view, love was not a bond of two souls. It was the will to life playing puppeteer. It wasn't romance, it was manipulation wearing perfume. Love led people to murder, to betrayal, to madness, and all of it was driven by a blind force with no regard for reason. Think of every moment you've lost sleep thinking about someone. Every time you couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't focus. Was that divine? Or was it a form of possession? Now, most people hear this and recoil. They ask them, what's the point? If love is a lie, is there anything left worth holding on to? And that's the part most miss. Schopenhauer didn't lay this truth bare to cause despair. He did it to give us freedom. Because when you see the strings, you can stop being a marionette. The moment you realize love is a trick, the desperation begins to dissolve. What replaces it is not numbness, but clarity. You stop chasing shadows. You start seeing through them. And in that silence, after the illusion is shattered, you find something else. Solitude. Not loneliness, not absence, but solitude. The kind that terrifies men because it cannot be filled by distraction. And that's exactly why it's the doorway to power. Now picture another scene, a room dim and silent. The only sound is the soft crackling of firewood. Books are piled high, some open, some half read, some read so often they've lost their covers. The world outside bustles, dinners are being shared, hands are being held, weddings are being planned. But none of that noise touches this room. And inside, alone, is Schopenhauer. And he is smiling. Because he knows something that terrifies others. That being alone is not a punishment. It is the last refuge of those who no longer wish to lie to themselves. Most people run from their own minds like it's a burning building. They rush into relationships they don't need. They bury themselves in small talk, in scrolling, in dopamine bursts masquerading as human contact. Why? Because silence demands confrontation. And in that silence, your mask begins to slip. Arthur believed that solitude wasn't just necessary, it was sacred. The only environment where a man could begin to become real. He once wrote that freedom and aloneness are twins. You cannot possess one without embracing the other. Society will tell you the opposite, that to be alone is to fail. That if you have no partner, no party, no approval, you are incomplete. That is the herd's lie, the mythology of the masses. And Schopenhauer ripped it to shreds. Because he saw what solitude produces when it is not feared. Greatness. Michelangelo, with hammer and chisel, sculpted alone for years, breathing life into stone. Tesla, shut away in labs, heard music in electricity. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by war, wrote his soul's truth into pages never meant to be read aloud. These were not social men. These were men unafraid of the echo chamber of their own thoughts. But modern man avoids that echo at all costs. He fills his calendar, his feed, his bed, anything to avoid being left with himself. And in doing so, he becomes hollow. Let me give you an example that might haunt you. In the 1600s, there was a nobleman imprisoned in a stone tower. No letters, no voices, no light, just a man and his mind. Most would have shattered. He didn't. He created. He wrote ideas so volatile they were locked away for centuries. When he emerged, his body was frail, but his mind was carved from fire. You don't find that kind of strength in the crowd. Because real solitude is not just absence of company, it is presence with self. Deep, ruthless presence. It demands you stare at the ugliest parts of you without turning away, and most men simply cannot do it. They've built their entire identity on what others reflect back at them. Without that mirror, they see nothing, just a void. But here's the revelation. That void, it's not empty. It's the beginning. Schopenhauer believed that true solitude births genius, not comfort, not ease, but genius, not because it makes you happy, but because it strips away the lies. When the world is silent and all masks fall, what remains is either ashes or diamonds. Van Gogh found it in asylum walls. Nietzsche found it wandering mountains alone. Bruce Lee found it in empty gyms, practicing for no one but the mirror. These weren't men coddled by companionship. They were men forged by fire. But here's the catch. Solitude doesn't just reveal. It tests. It breaks what is weak in you. It forces you to admit things you've buried under years of performance. And once you see those truths, you can't unsee them. That is why so many cling to noise. They know deep down that silence doesn't lie. And now we arrive at the threshold of something deeper, because beyond the rejection of love, beyond the embrace of solitude, lies something even more terrifying, the collapse of identity itself. The realization that everything you've called you might be nothing more than a performance, a dream. That is where we go next. Picture this. You're standing before a mirror, not just any reflection, but one that strips away everything you've ever pretended to be. At first you see what you expect, your face, your posture, your usual performance. But as the seconds pass and the silence deepens, the cracks begin to form. You look into your eyes and something foreign stares back. It's not you, at least not the you you've always introduced to the world. That carefully managed identity, the name, the resume, the beliefs you parrot, the fears you hide, it starts dissolving. What remains isn't clarity. It's something far more disturbing. A question without an answer. Who are you? This isn't a question Schopenhauer asked politely. He demanded it. He took the concept of identity, held it under a microscope, and then dismantled it piece by piece. What you call yourself, he argued, is just a story told so often that you forgot it was fiction. And not even your story, something implanted, conditioned, shaped by family, society, biology. Your desires? Not yours. Your ambitions? Chosen for you. Your morality? Imitated from the herd. The face in the mirror isn't a person. It's a costume. And beneath it, there's no stable core. Just shifting dust blown by the wind of instincts. Most men spend their entire lives defending this illusion. They polish it, protect it, kill for it. But Schopenhauer ripped the mask away and showed what lies underneath. The will. A primal, unconscious hunger that operates beneath every decision you think you've made. Not a conscious goal, not reason, not logic, just a blind, unrelenting need to perpetuate itself, to acquire, to dominate, to reproduce, to survive. You don't make choices, you execute its demands. Every act of kindness, every flash of rage, every ambition that felt yours was just the will whispering through you. You think you chose your career? The will needed status. You think you fell in love? The will needed genes to mix. You think you pursued justice? The will wanted dominance in another mask. You are not the author of your story. You are the ink being spilled on a page written by something older than your name. Let me tell you a story that fractures the myth of self like glass under pressure. In the late 1700s, French physicians began documenting cases of identity fugue, people who suddenly abandoned their homes, vanished for weeks, and reappeared living new lives, new names, new personalities, no memory of their former existence. A kind father becomes a silent blacksmith in another town. A devout woman turns into a gambler with no remorse. These weren't performances. These were full shifts in being. When brought back, they had no answers. Just an eerie calm, as if the old identity had never truly existed. Schopenhauer wouldn't have seen these cases as anomalies. He would have seen them as unfiltered glimpses into the truth. The self is not stable. It's scaffolding propped up by the will. And sometimes that scaffolding collapses. He didn't stop there. He argued that everything we perceive as meaning is warped through this invisible force. The will does not care if you are kind or cruel, noble or vile. It only cares about persistence, and it wears 1,000 disguises. For some it speaks in ambition, for others lust, for many fear, but always, always it is hunger, that unnameable pull you feel at 3 a.m, the ache that no achievement can silence, the compulsion to keep reaching even when your hands are bleeding. That is the will. It's in the way we sabotage things we care about, driven by fears that make no sense. It's in the way we cling to routines that destroy us, even when we swear we want freedom. It's the voice that whispers, more, even as your soul pleads for peace. You mistake that voice for your own, but it is not you. It never was. Now imagine living your entire life dancing to that rhythm, never realizing it wasn't your song. That's what most people do. They call it purpose, they call it destiny, but it's compulsion in disguise, and the cost? Your entire life becomes a maze with no center, a play with no audience. You chase love only to ruin it. You seek success only to feel emptier than when you started. You fight battles only to forget why. And the will smiles, because it got what it wanted: movement. But there is a way out, not easy, not safe, but real. Schopenhauer believed that the only true freedom begins when you stop playing the game, when you stop obeying the will's demands, not through resistance, but through awareness. You must become the observer, not the puppet, the witness, not the actor. And to do that, you must be willing to look at every thought, every desire, every fear, and ask, is this mine? Or is this the will pretending to be me? The moment you ask that sincerely, the chains begin to loosen. He wasn't the only one to glimpse this. Buddhist monks, centuries before him, practiced the art of dissolving the self. They meditated not to find peace, but to uncover truth. Truth so raw it left no room for identity. They called it sunyata, emptiness, not nihilism, not despair. But the clarity that comes from realizing that you are not your name, not your memories, not even your mind, just awareness floating in stillness. They sat in silence for years, stripping away each layer of ego like old skin, until only presence remained. Schopenhauer admired them. He believed they had come closer to escaping the will than anyone in the West. While empires built themselves on power and religion and conquest, these men vanished into caves to dismantle the self brick by brick, not to escape life, but to finally meet it without the will in control. But the Western world built its temples on the illusion of self. Careers, politics, ideologies, even love, all of it crumbles when you see through that illusion. That's why society resists this idea so fiercely, because if the self is fiction, then the systems built on it are meaningless too. Let me tell you something that will bend your idea of history. When Spanish conquistadors stormed into the Americas, they claimed divine purpose. They brought banners, scripture, declarations of noble intent. But what they really carried was the will, wrapped in symbols, masked as mission, gold, glory, expansion. Those weren't values, they were compulsions. The Aztecs, too, engaged in human sacrifice, thinking it fed the gods. But Schopenhauer would have said it wasn't theology. It was the will's demand for blood, chaos in sacred clothing. Two civilizations locked in a cycle of death and dominance. Neither saw the strings. Both called their madness sacred. The will, meanwhile, simply kept moving. And if you think you're separate from that, think again. Every time you seek approval, every time you crave recognition, every time you ache to belong or to conquer, you're feeding the same engine. The names have changed, the force hasn't. But now we come to the breaking point. If all this is true, what is left? If the self is an illusion and love is a lie and every desire is a trap, what's the point of anything? That's the abyss. And standing at its edge is terrifying. Most turn back. They retreat into the comfort of delusion. They double down on identity. They cling to goals. They chase distractions. Anything to avoid staring into that silence. But a few, very few, step forward. And what they find is not emptiness, it's freedom. Schopenhauer didn't preach despair, he offered release. The idea wasn't to end life, but to change how you exist inside it. He called it the denial of the will, not through destruction, but through surrender. Not passive, not defeatist, but lucid. The will cannot be killed, but it can be seen. And when it's seen, it loses power. You stop chasing, you start witnessing. You become the space between thoughts, the silence behind the scream, the calm in the storm. You live without needing to dominate or submit, without needing to possess or be possessed. And that's not apathy, that's mastery. Artists sometimes touch this. In moments of pure creation, when they lose sense of time, ego, even self, they enter a state beyond the will's grip. Athletes describe it as the zone. Warriors call it flow. Musicians describe it as becoming the music. In those moments, the self vanishes, and all that remains is being. Not the kind of being that asks, "Who am I?" but the kind that simply is. But this freedom comes at a cost. You cannot unsee. Once the illusion is broken, you can't go back. You'll hear people talking about love, and you'll know they're dreaming. You'll see men chasing power, and you'll see them as puppets. You'll walk through cities built on identity, and they'll feel like stage sets. The dream won't hold anymore. And that isolation is real. That's why most people never take this path. Because once the mask falls, it doesn't go back on. And when you wake up, you realize just how asleep the world really is. But if you're brave enough, what lies on the other side is something few ever touch. Peace that doesn't need reason. Power that needs no audience. A life unshackled from compulsion. And now we prepare for the final descent. The illusion of love has been exposed. The prison of identity has cracked. The will's strings have begun to fray. But there is one last transformation waiting, one last threshold to cross. The annihilation not of self, but of separation. Where what remains is not a person, not a thinker, not even a soul. Just pure, radiant awareness, watching the world with no need to interfere. And that, my friend, is what part 3 reveals. You've torn through the myths. You've watched love crumble into instinct. You've seen solitude reshape itself from punishment into revelation. You've stood before the mirror and witnessed your identity dissolve like mist under scrutiny. Now we enter territory that leaves even the boldest trembling, because it's one thing to lose illusions and another to realize that the very idea of separation, of subject and object, self and other, was never real to begin with. Most men stop at the edge. They sense the truth creeping in, a faint murmur at the base of their spine. They shut their eyes and call it madness. They run towards safety, even if that safety is built on lies. But those who linger at the threshold, those who dare not to turn away, they cross into something wordless. Schopenhauer didn't just unravel the soul. He stripped the entire cosmos of pretense. He declared that this world, as beautiful or horrifying as it may appear, is not a creation made for us, not a divine stage, not a moral battleground, just an endless unfolding of blind force, driven by the will. Not will as in determination, will as in primal compulsion. Everything, from galaxies to germs, is moved by it. And so are you. The tragedy isn't that you suffer. The tragedy is that you were taught to expect otherwise. That love would save you. That self-discovery would complete you. That life had a purpose waiting like a gift just out of reach. But Schopenhauer tore that script apart. He didn't write a new one. He simply pointed at the silence underneath it all and said, that is real. So what remains when everything else is burned away? Not philosophy, not emotion, not even thought. What remains is pure perception, pure witness. You watch, but you don't react. You move, but not from craving. You exist, but without clinging. The world continues its dance. The predators, the lovers, the broken-hearted poets, the empire builders, and you watch, like the sky watches a battlefield, present but untouched. This is what Schopenhauer pointed toward in his rare moments of almost mystical clarity. He glimpsed a state beyond suffering, not because the pain stops, but because the identity that owns the pain dissolves. That's the secret buried in his bleakness. He wasn't trying to trap you in despair. He was trying to drag you out of delusion. He knew it would hurt, but he also knew that on the other side of that agony was something unshakable. Let me tell you a story from a world far removed from philosophy. In the mountains of Japan during the Warring States period, there was a swordsman named Takuan who trained in silence. He didn't learn battle strategies. He didn't learn forms. He sat in stillness for days, for weeks, until the blade in his hand no longer felt like an object, until there was no separation between him and the movement. When asked how he defeated his opponents, he didn't speak of skill. He said, "There was no me. There was no enemy. There was only action. That is what it means to dissolve the self." In this state, there is no longer fear, because fear requires a future. There is no longer regret, because regret depends on a fixed past. What remains is immediacy, presence so complete that even the idea of time folds in on itself. You become like the flame that dances, not caring what it burns, only that it burns clearly. Schopenhauer revered those rare individuals who touch this truth. Saints, artists, mystics, but not because they were righteous, because they saw the game and refused to play. They didn't rage against life. They didn't cling to it either. They stepped outside its machinery. The will could not possess them because they saw through it. And when you see the will, really see it, not just as theory, but as the force behind every impulse, it can no longer use you. But this realization is not a trophy. It does not make you superior. In fact, it strips you of superiority entirely. It humbles you in the most violent way, because now, when you look at the world, you no longer see good and evil. You no longer see heroes and villains. You see motion. You see hunger taking shape in 1,000 forms. Even the most brutal men, dictators, warlords, liars, they are not evil in some cartoonish sense. They are simply puppets whose strings are pulled harder. And those who suffer, they too are caught in the same machinery. Everyone is dancing, bleeding, begging under the same invisible law. So what's left to do? You could disappear into cynicism. You could mock the world, scoff at the lovers and the dreamers, retreat into bitterness. But that's just another face of the will. The will feeds on hatred as easily as it feeds on desire. The real escape is different. It doesn't look heroic. It doesn't look impressive. It looks like stillness. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It's the refusal to be pushed. Stillness is a man who sees the bait and does not bite. Who sees the storm inside and lets it pass? Who hears the siren song of longing and lets it fade without answering? The man who reaches that stillness is not without emotion. He feels everything, but he no longer identifies with the flood. He no longer drowns in it. He watches grief arrive, and he allows it to speak. He feels rage rise, and he does not flinch. He tastes joy, but does not clutch it. He lives fully, but without intoxication. And here's the paradox. Once you stop chasing happiness, peace begins to arrive. Once you stop trying to become someone, you begin to see who you were before the mask. That's not enlightenment. That's reality. And yet, most will never get here. They'll continue running in circles, whispering affirmations into mirrors, buying books that promise transformation, screaming about purpose, chasing validation, clinging to status. They'll call it life, they'll call it growth, but it's just the wheel turning, just more movement, more noise. You have a choice. You can climb back on that wheel, or you can sit down, not in surrender, in clarity. Try this. The next time you feel consumed by love, by anger, by fear, pause. Don't suppress it. Don't indulge it. Just notice it. Watch the craving like a flame. Observe the thought without following it. Feel the pull without moving your feet. That is the beginning. The moment of power. Not when you act, but when you don't. That moment breaks the spell, the will recoils, and you begin to taste what freedom really is. Not the freedom to do whatever you want. That's just more slavery disguised. Real freedom is the ability to not want, to not be dragged, to not be tricked, to stand in the middle of the storm and feel no urgency to run or fight, only to be. And when you reach that state, something extraordinary begins to unfold. The world stripped of meaning becomes beautiful in its pointlessness. A leaf falling is not a metaphor, it's just a leaf. And that's enough. A stranger's smile doesn't signal fate, it's just kindness. And that's enough. Music doesn't need a message, it is what it is. And that's enough. You stop seeking depth because you finally reached it. This is why, toward the end of his life, Schopenhauer found a strange kind of peace. He stopped writing with venom. He began to enjoy the mundane, walks, books, silence. He no longer tried to save anyone. He simply watched the world with soft eyes and let it pass. He wasn't happy, but he was free. And that's the hardest truth of all. Happiness was never the goal. Happiness is a ripple on the surface of a much deeper ocean. If you chase it, you disturb the water. If you stop moving, it might come. But even then, you don't hold it. You just watch it arrive and then you watch it leave, like everything else. So where does that leave you? You've listened this far. Something in you already suspects what I'm saying is true. Maybe you've tasted moments of it. Those rare seconds where everything felt clear, where you stopped needing, stopped proving. Maybe you've already lost faith in the stories you used to tell yourself. Maybe that's why you're here. Then take this as your final test. The next time you feel alone, don't panic. The next time love tears into you, don't call it fate. The next time your identity crumbles, don't try to glue it back together. Let it fall. Let it all fall. Because what's underneath isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to breathe, space to be, space to finally stop running. And in that space, you'll find not answers, but something far more honest. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled, the kind that simply is, the kind that listens to the madness of the world and says nothing, because it doesn't need to. So now you stand at the edge, not of despair, but of awakening. You've seen love's disguise. You've walked alone through the fire of solitude. You've torn off the mask of self and looked directly into the will that moves everything, and you're still here. Now ask yourself quietly, what am I without wanting? Don't answer, just feel the space where the question lives. Because in that space, the will loses its grip, and something else begins. Not something you can name, something that doesn't need to be named. You awake. If you're still listening, you already know. You're no longer dreaming. You're witnessing, and the world will never be the same again.